Welcome everyone. My name is Owen Johnston and I am Partnerships Manager at the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Centre, or Modern Slavery PEC for short. Thank you so much for joining today. It's been fantastic to see the level of interest in today's lunchtime seminar. So I'm just going to give some very quick housekeeping announcements, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Izzy, who'll be chairing today's session. So just to note that you'll see your microphone and your camera are both turned off by default, but the chat is turned on. So please do post questions in that throughout today's session. We'll hold questions until after the main presentation, but feel free to add them whenever, and we'll take a note and make sure that they're shared with the speaker. You'll see also that we're recording today's event. That includes both the presentation and the Q&A. However, you as a participant are not visible on that recording, and the chat is also not visible on that recording. And when we share questions from the chat, we'll try and do that anonymously. So please do feel free to ask your questions and share your comments, and they won't be part of the recording, but we will make that recording available afterwards for anyone who's unable to make it today. And if you do prefer to use a pseudonym, please feel free to do that. The Modern Slavery PEC has a set of meeting rules that we use for any events that we host or organise, which are available on our website. And we will post a link to those in the chat now. These are in recognition that a variety of different people will attend these events, including people who may have lived experience of modern slavery, and in order to ensure that we create a safe and productive space for everyone who has joined. So do please be aware that there could be people in attendance who do have lived experience of modern slavery, and while there's absolutely no requirement to disclose any experiences during the event in any way, we'd ask everyone to be mindful that statements could be made which do disclose personal narratives of modern slavery, and also ask you to please be sensitive in any questions or comments that you make accordingly. I'm not going to read through the entire set of meeting rules, but the link is in the chat, and we'd encourage you to take a quick look if you have a moment. And just to emphasize that while I'm sure it absolutely won't be an issue, we do always ensure that if anyone violates any of those rules, we do reserve the right to remove them from the meeting to keep the space as open and safe and productive as possible. So just to recap the rationale for these events, these lunchtime seminars, we've held a series of these now, and the purpose of them was to provide a platform for modern slavery researchers to share their latest findings with a really diverse audience. So other researchers, but also practitioners and policymakers and people who are directly affected by modern slavery. And that's because part of the Modern Slavery PEC's role, we believe, is to promote robust and relevant evidence as widely as possible, in particular with people who can then use that evidence to inform their work, the decisions that they make, to lead to better policies and better practices. So what we ask researchers to do is to present key findings from their work in plain language that non-experts can easily understand, and to really focus on the real-world implications of that work, especially for people and communities directly affected, as well as policymakers and practitioners. So I'm going to hand over in a moment to my colleague Izzy, who'll be chairing today's session. Izzy will introduce our speaker, who will then present for about 15 minutes. After that, we'll have Q&A for the remainder of the session, and we'll finish on time at 1:15. As I said, do post your questions and comments in the chat at any time, and we'll address those all after the presentation. I think that's everything I have to say by way of housekeeping. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Izzy Templer, in order to introduce our speaker and today's topic. Over to you, Izzy.
Thanks so much, Owen. My name's Izzy Templer. I'm the Research Operations Manager at the Modern Slavery PEC, and I'm really delighted to be introducing Dr. Anna Skeels today. Anna is a research fellow at Cardiff University Social Sciences Research Park. Her research interests include children and modern slavery, refugee and migration studies, and children's rights. She previously worked for the Wales Centre for Public Policy and has a particular interest in participatory methods for children and young people in research. Today, Anna's going to be talking about her PEC-funded research examining the Independent Child Trafficking Guardianship Service, which you might hear referred to as ICTG throughout today's presentation. This is a Home Office commissioned service, commissioned support intervention for children and young people with lived experience of exploitation, and currently it's contracted to Barnardo's. One of the PEC's guiding principles for research is to look at effectiveness and what works, what could work to improve outcomes for people with lived experience of modern slavery. And we identified an evidence gap sort of for looking at the ICTG service and exploring how it can have and what its impact is on long-term outcomes for children and young people. Child exploitation in particular is really complex and often hidden. It's an extreme violation of children's protection and their rights. And children who experience exploitation often have complex needs such as immigration, education, or health concerns, which need to be addressed sort of within a different area of support that they receive. The ICTG service provides direct and indirect specialist and trauma-informed support to children affected by trafficking in England and Wales, and this is what Anna's explored in particular in her work. We're really excited to have the research published today, as this represents sort of a new funding model that we've been trialling at the PEC. So Anna joined us as our first research fellow. So this is a new method for us to deliver research, where Anna worked very closely with us and colleagues at Barnardo's. We were able to develop a really close collaboration between the Modern Slavery PEC, Anna and Barnardo's, which allowed Anna to gain a deeper understanding into the ways of working of the organisation. The report, which has been published today, uses innovative participatory methods to bring together the latest academic research on long-term outcomes for children with the perspective of practitioners and young people within the ICTG service. So without further ado, I will hand over to Anna to talk through some of the findings of her research.
Thanks so much, Izzy. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for making the time to join over your lunch hour or another part of the day. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here to talk about the research, and as Izzy said, focusing on exploring support for children affected by modern slavery in England and Wales, and particularly focusing on the independent child trafficking guardianship service in England and Wales. The research has been a joint effort, so myself and then also Dr. Katie Huxley, also from Spark in Cardiff University, and Hannah Stott from Safe to Grow. And as Izzy said, there's been really engaged involvement by Barnardo's and the ICTG service itself to enable that deep understanding of the service and really maximise the participation of young people engaged with the service as well, which I'll talk a bit about. So a little bit about my background. I'm both a researcher and a practitioner, so my work has always involved looking at the areas of children's rights, child participation, child protection, working with a range of children and young people in different contexts and different situations, both in the UK and overseas, and thinking about both the kind of problems related to child protection, but also solutions and support. And I guess the question maybe that has cut across all of that is, how are things done? And is this the best way to do them for children? The problem or the challenge that I'm going to talk to you about in this lunchtime seminar, and as this slide shows some recent statistics around this problem, is that of children and modern slavery in the UK. And we're going to be focusing on England and Wales, as I mentioned before. And modern slavery, as I'm sure you all know, is an extreme violation of children's protection on their rights. And we often hear about the exploitation of children and young people, but we don't hear so much about their recovery, the support that's available for them, and the outcomes that come out of that support and the services that are there to support them. Children affected by modern slavery in England and Wales, as we've already said, are supported by the Independent Child Trafficking Guardianship Service, and that's currently delivered by Barnardo's, and it's a requirement of the Modern Slavery Act 2015. And this research is focusing on the outcomes for children and young people affected by modern slavery and supported by the ICTG service. So what are the benefits and limitations of the service, particularly from their perspective? And it involves asking 25 young people supported by independent guardians about the outcomes that have been enabled by the service and that matter to them. So what did we do and why? Our research included 5 different components. So the quantitative research, the numerical focus research, involved looking at over 4 years of numerical data on the problem of children and exploitation in England and Wales. And we drew from data from the National Referral Mechanism, which you may know as the UK government's framework to identify and support victims of trafficking in the UK, and also data from the ICTG service. Then we also looked at outcomes for children and young people by drawing on analysis of a sample of 400 cases of young people, case closure summaries from the ICTG service. We did focus groups with 53 practitioners across the different regions of the ICTG service. And we also engage young people, importantly, using a participatory method called Q methodology, or Q. So this was 25 young people supported by the service, directly engaged by the research. We also recruited and supported 10 young people from the Barnardo service to form a young people's advisory group, and they engaged in helping us to steer the design of the research, the analysis of the results, and also the dissemination of the findings. And you'll actually hear from them directly later on in a video that we're going to show you about their, I guess, their perspectives and their understanding of the findings from the research in their view, in their words. This diagram here shows a young person undertaking what is known as a Q sort. So this is a key part of the methodology that we used. And essentially this involves sorting, ranking, prioritizing 28 outcome statements across a grid ranging from agree to disagree. And a lot of these outcome statements came from the Creating Stable Futures Positive Outcomes framework, which was co-produced with young people with lived experience of human trafficking. That research was also funded by Modern Slavery PEC and undertaken by Professor Patricia Hines at Sheffield Hallam University in partnership with ECPAT UK and other partners. And this has been really key, this framework, to enabling us to think about outcomes with children and young people and how they understand them and think about them in their own words and their own ways. So what did we find and what does it mean? And I'm going to talk to you about 4 findings from our research, and you can see much more of the detail in the reports that are shared on the website. But first of all, we found that the ICTG service delivers a flexible, multi-layered pyramid of service support, enabling positive outcomes for the safeguarding, protection, well-being and recovery of children. And what we've got here is this pyramid of service support with its different layers. And this came out of us looking initially at the case closure data. So the kind of width of the layer shows you how often this particular area of support and outcomes associated with it were mentioned. So safety here is really key, as you can see, foundational across the base of the pyramid and throughout support for children and young people. But the really important thing in addition to this is that when we did the focus group discussions with practitioners, and also when we did the ranking and sorting exercise with children and young people, we found that these areas of support and related outcomes also came through, and that I guess the order and the priorities were very similar and helped us to really reinforce these findings. Our second finding is that all the young people who participated in the research, all 25 of them, agreed that the ICTG service has supported them to achieve positive outcomes that matter to them and their lives. And this slide shows you some of the statements that all or all but one of those young people agreed with when asked in relation to support from your Barnardo's worker. So, for example, because of support from my Barnardo's worker, my culture, religion and identity are respected. Because of support from my Barnardo's worker, I have people I can trust to support me. And in the one case where young people have not agreed with those statements, it was very clear to us why that was happening, and that the ICTG worker concerned was actually working with them to address a particular issue that they were facing. The third finding is that using Q methodology, we were able to generate new evidence on how the ICTG service performs in a very flexible and adaptive way, and how it can meet a range of different needs across different groups of young people. And what we identified was 5 distinct outcome profiles through the research. So what do I mean by outcome profiles? So, for example, group 1, or the first outcome profile, was a group of young people that were safe, well, and moving forwards. So the ICTG service is enabling these young people to focus on their immediate needs, their immediate well-being and recovery, helping them to feel safe and supported in the here and now, and focused on achieving positive shorter-term outcomes. And other groups had different characteristics and needs and different outcomes that were coming from the service. And this demonstrated to us the ability of the service to support children and young people flexibly and inclusively. The fourth finding is that the ICTG service for children and young people and the direct workers are seen as trusted adults for children and young people who consider them instrumental to their participation, protection, and achievement of positive outcomes. And as we've noted before, that statement about having someone that they can trust to support them was agreed with by all 25 young people, but also a lot of the data and a lot of the case closure summaries and the discussion with young people brought out this really key role of the guardian as this trusted adult. And for some of those young people, they were the only one that they had who provided this role for them in their lives. Based on our findings, what should be done? So you can read much more detail on this in the report and how the findings and evidence feed into these recommendations, but I just want to touch on them here. So for the UK government, based on the overwhelmingly positive picture of young people's experience of being supported by the ICTG service across a range of outcome areas, we recommend that the ICTG service is extended to the whole of England and Wales rather than 2/3 of local authorities in England and Wales. Based on the participation of children and young people in the research itself, and also in steering the research and the added benefits and the real value of that, both for the findings but also for those children and young people themselves, we recommend that children's participation is included in any commissioned evaluation or research that's commissioned on the ICTG service going forward. We also recommend, based on the importance of the flexible and dynamic approach of the service and how this can adapt to meet the needs of different young people and children that are being supported, that the UK government maintains this dynamic, responsive and needs-led nature to the ICTG service. Practitioners' views and experiences and thoughts of how they are seeing exploitation of children through their work and in their different areas leads us to recommend that there's a further coordination of access to ongoing ICTG service intelligence alongside information, for example, coming through the NRM, National Referral Mechanism. And finally, for longer term, after the ICTG service, tracking and monitoring outcomes of children and young people, we would recommend that the UK government investigate sharing and linking data securely to be able to measure these longer term outcomes. For Barnardo's, we recommend a new participatory holistic outcomes measurement tool, which builds on what they already have in place, but something that can be fed into from this research and also the Creating Stable Futures Positive Outcomes framework. Given the challenge of point of transition, both from the service and to adulthood, we recommend routine recording of outstanding concerns at these points of transition. And also, given the positive experience of having a young researchers or young advisory group engaged in the research, we recommend further exploration and establishing, if not already in place, a young researchers group connected to the service. Finally, in terms of further research, there's always gaps that can be addressed. So as I've already mentioned, the longer term impact of the ICTG service on outcomes for children and young people, ensuring that all voices are heard. So for this research, we were focusing on children and young people over the age of 11, but obviously younger people are also supported by the ICTG service, and also UK-born young people, an additional sort of focus on those young people who are often supported indirectly by the service. And then finally, further exploring the role of the independent guardian as trusted adult. There's a lot of research out there about the role of trusted adults for children and young people and the benefits of this. And I think that the ICTG service and the role of guardians as trusted adults could be connected to this. So without further ado, I'm going to signpost to the video where the 10 young people we worked with are going to explain what came out of the research for children and young people in their own words. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Anna. I'm just going to queue up the video now. If I could just ask Izzy to confirm that you can see that.
Yeah, it's coming through.
Benefit of help young people, always there, respect and support children in different nationality, and raising young people voice through socials, develop confidence and tell you all opportunity you can have, especially you are Barnardos. Thank you.
Barnardo's workers have been amazing in fulfilling ambitions with respect as well as supporting the needs of young people and always there to raise their voices and providing different ideas and opportunities and assuring successful outcomes in the lives of young people. You are indeed precious.
Barnardo's is the best, always there to help, raising people's voice, never judgmental, always there to listen to you and advise you, respect you as a person and treat you equal, deliver fabulous service for young people of all cultures and communities, supporting their everyday needs.
Believing in yourself when you start a talks. Avoid those who are negative and hold you back. Respect them positive things and embrace them. Never walk alone and stay strong. Abide by rules and stay safe. Rely on friends who are loyal. Dreams never come true unless you work hard and have goals. Opportunity might visit you once talk it. Stay positive and shine up always. بڕوات بە خۆت بێ کاتێک کارێک دەست پێەکەیت دوور بکەوە لەوانەی نەرێنین و ڕادەگرن ڕێزی ئەرێنی بیرکردنەوەکان بگرە و لە ئامێزیان دابنێ هەرگیز بە تەنها مەڕۆ بەهێز بە ملکەچی بەو سەلامەت بە پشت بە هاوڕێ ببەستە ئەوانەی بەوەفان خەونەکان نایەنەدی ئەگەر بە باشی کاریان بۆ نەکەیت هەل لەوانەیە جارێک ڕووسەردانت بکە وەریان بگرە ئەرێنی بمێنەوە و چەناگەت بە هەمیشە بەرز بێت
Believe in me, always there for me, right, new experience, answer for me, responsibility, dreams, opportunity, support.
Barnardo's workers have been amazing, understanding, and will go out of their way to reach out to other professionals that can help young people's needs and expectations be met. They make sure to always be available at all times to answer queries, solve problems, and pass on disturbing information to reliable professionals that can provide support if it is beyond their services. Dear Barnardo's workers, your amazing support in changing the lives of young people is forever cherished, and the different opportunities you've provided us with are not taken for granted. I am sure you would continue to support young people and impact their lives, and would continue to share your great work out there.
Believe and respect nice, accomplished, realistic, down-to-earth, organized, supportive, secure, self-confident.
Fernandez, believe me every time, always help me for football and every time. Respect me and I respect to him and him to help me to meet new friends. They help me to more them. Always me to travel to my friend, ready to help me every time. Don't back to me when I need help. Offering support me to young people. Support me for college.
Bernardo has always believed on me when no one believed on me. Bernardo is always raising young people's voice. New experience is important. Bernardo is always asking me if I'm good when I'm feeling down. Bernardo is always respecting me. Bernardo is always help the young people to be independent. Bernardo is always developing me, developing my life. Barnardo is always offering help all the times. Barnardo is always supporting me under any conditions. Thanks.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Owen, and Anna, thank you so much for your presentation and going through all the findings of the research. I think it's so important to hear those and then hear the voices of young people directly as well. Such a great video. So we're going to move on to the Q&A section for today. So please do pop questions in the chat if you have anything that you'd like to ask Anna. There's one in there already we can start off with. So there's a question to ask if we could share a little bit more about the criteria for inclusion in the Young People's Advisory Group and how you manage confidentiality issues in setting up the group. And I think maybe to add to that, it would be great to hear some reflections on sort of the challenges and the opportunities that came with having a Young People's Advisory Group as part of the project.
Yeah, thanks, Izzy. So with the Young People's Advisory Group, we were looking for young people who were either in the service or who had left the service but were still in touch with Barnardo's. So in this case, choosing to kind of stay in touch themselves with the Barnardo's service. Most of them were older and, as determined by the ICTG service, young people who were perhaps more resilient or at a particular stage of their recovery where they felt that being engaged in this group would be positive and sort of relevant and appropriate for them. We looked for a balance between males and females. So we had five girls and 5 boys who were involved in it. It tended to be young people, like I said, who were sort of older, so 16, 17, and a couple of them, I think, just turned 18, but were still being supported by the service during that important transitional period. And I think what we did was we kind of shared recruitment materials that were circulated throughout the service. Young people could express an interest and talk it through with their guardian, and then we had a series of workshops. In terms of confidentiality, I was only aware of the first name of those young people, and I had contact with their guardians, and the focus was very much on the service, what comes out of the service, the benefits and the limitations of the service, not on the history of their own circumstances or exploitation, and that wasn't discussed or shared. In terms of the challenges and opportunities, I think, Barnardo's obviously worked really hard to enable young people to participate in the research and to be part of this Young People's Advisory Group. And it is additional work, and bringing those young people together, obviously it takes careful planning, and it takes the guardians to sort of support those young people because they are their trusted adults. So I guess logistics can be a bit of a challenge in getting everybody together in the same place, although we did have a couple of online meetings. I think also Obviously, young people's situations change, so that's a challenge, but at the same time, it's something that you just expect and you are flexible around. And obviously, their lives are the priority, not the work of the advisory group or the research. But the opportunities are massive, I would say. The opportunity to recognise and draw on the skills and strengths and ideas and perspectives of those young people and really emphasise how much they have to contribute to the research and how they can help to shape it and communicate it to other children and young people who are in similar situations to them. So it's something that I think would be great to build on if it's possible for us to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Anna. So the next question coming up in the chat is asking about the group of young people. I assume this means a group of young people who undertook the Q-sort activity, so sorting the set of statements about the impact of having an ICTG support worker. So it's asking if any of that group were in the care of local authorities, and if so, how did the role of the ICTG work alongside the social worker role? And I guess maybe we could expand that out into generally, maybe if you could expand a bit upon how the ICTG service sort of sits in the broader landscape of child protection, child safeguarding.
Yeah, so in the reports, we talk quite clearly about how ICTG direct and indirect workers are obviously one of a number of professionals that are working with these children and young people and impacting on their protection and safeguarding, as you mentioned. And I think when we kind of looked at the data, I think one of the kind of key most prominent sort of workers that was mentioned and referenced in the data was social workers for children and young people. So, this is one of the roles and the one that we were focusing on. But obviously, we recognise that a number of roles kind of feed into these children and young people's well-being. In terms of those that were supported by local authority, I mean, again, I didn't have those details, although a small number were UK-born young people, and a number of them were non-UK-born young people who had been unaccompanied and separated children. So in that case, didn't have a figure of parental responsibility within the UK. So I would assume that quite a large number were also supported by local authorities. I think that for those young people who had indirect workers, the role of these indirect workers or regional practice coordinators is to connect with all the sort of services and professionals around the child or young person, and to ensure that there is that coordination of support. And that came through really clearly. And we had a number of case studies which showed how social workers and different professionals within local authorities work closely with the guardians to actually deliver positive outcomes for children and people and their protection.
Thanks, Anna. So the next question that we've got is if you could tell us sort of what your standout moment was from doing the research, which I think is such a lovely thing to sort of be able to reflect on.
That's a really great question. I would say there's been a lot of standout moments, but probably the one for me, which Izzy probably knows because I've told her about, is so the youngest person that was involved directly in the research, who was a young sort of UK-born male who, as soon as we started the Q-sort activity that I've shown you, said, it's okay, I've done it all, and I can tell you now it's a rubbish activity, and these are the reasons why, which was just fantastic. And then, we then circled back round to, okay, well, why do you think that? And then kind of working through the sort of sorting and ranking exercise and understanding it from his perspective, but still also getting the results, but doing it in a very different way, and having to sort of be flexible, but still getting the data that we needed. But for me, that was a real plus. I just love that, and I think, that's what we want to hear. We want to know. That isn't end of conversation. That's beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. You cannot beat the honesty of children and young but perfect research participants for getting honest sort of feedback and answers. Actually, just sort of on the back of that, I might just jump a bit inside the order of the questions. Somebody's asked if you could expand a little bit more about the Q methodology. I think this is a really good point to do that, because it just sort of, that example demonstrates the flexibility of it as a methodology to work with a range of different people who are coming at the same question from different angles. So maybe you could say a little bit more about how the methodology works and how you used it in this project.
Yeah, definitely. So so my background, I've done quite a lot of participatory research with children and young people using different kind of creative methods and techniques. And Q methodology is really interesting because, as you saw in the slide, it's an active exercise where the child or young person is sorting the statements onto the grid. And it's different to more traditional research methods in that they have the agency, they have the control over their activity. They're deciding where those cards go. They don't have to talk about it, but they can talk about it. They can talk about it at the beginning, they can talk about it throughout. They can decide which cards they, that they don't want to discuss because for a range of reasons, that's not something that's comfortable for them. But also they're doing the analysis. They're the ones who are explaining that image to you, and their thought processes. So in terms of trauma affected children and young people, I think it does give that control and agency and sense of not being subjected to sort of lots of questions from an interviewer and feeling a bit powerless in the face of that, or feeling that things are being extracted from you. Even with the best will in the world, of conducting interviews, it can feel like that for these children and young people. It's also a great method because the results that you get are directly comparable. So it's the same number of cards, it's the same grid, and on the back of the card you have numbers, and you can enter these into Q analysis. And what that will do is will show you how those children and people's views group, and how they're different and similar, but with statistical confidence. And often with participatory methods, it's you, the researcher, that's looking at drawings or diagrams or feedback and thinking, okay, well, where am I seeing similarities? How would I group these? But the great thing about Q is that the statistical component does that for you and helps you to say things with, I guess, a stronger degree of confidence. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there, but there's a lot I can say about Q methodology, and I think it's really interesting, and it's been used a lot with young people around sort of health, social care, where young people are looked after. So there's quite a lot of studies out there that people could refer to.
Thanks, Anna. And yeah, I think if people are interested, there's a bit more detail in the methodology section of the full report that's available on our website as well. I think just in terms of where we are on time, we'll take one final question, but would really encourage people. There's lots of interesting discussion in the chat and lots of interesting questions. And yes, so very happy to sort of take these, and maybe Anna, we could take some away, and if people wanted to chat by email, please do feel free to get in touch with us and we can continue discussions. Perhaps for final question, would be nice to sort of end on what next for the ICTG service. So there's some questions around which areas of support given were sort of deemed most effective. So perhaps you could reflect on that a bit, Anna, and then thinking about where the ICTGs might go next in terms of rollout. What would you think would be the key priorities for the service in that wider rollout based on the findings of the research?
Great, thanks, Izzy. So in terms of what next, in terms of, I guess, my work or building on the research, it's very important that the findings get fed back into practice. So we have a pot of funding for myself to work with Hannah Stott from Safe to Grow, and also the ICTG service to feed those findings back into the service and into service practice. So that's going to be happening, I think, from May onwards this year. And there's a couple of outputs that we're hoping to produce that then will be made available through induction and training within the service. There's the positive outcomes there's the sort of holistic outcomes measurement tool that I think would be important to develop. And I think Barnardo's already in discussion around the Creating Stable Futures Positive Outcomes framework. And I think looking at, you know, how is it possible to have a kind of ongoing participatory measurement of the service by children and young people who are in the service against that sort of range of outcome areas that matter and are important to them. So I think that's quite key. And then also exploring, as I said, maybe this sort of ongoing role of young people with lived experience of human trafficking as young researchers, not necessarily just on one project, but more generally. And for example, I know the Modern Slavery PEC, you have your lived experience advisory panel. So, you know, something similar to that, but that's more for children and young people. Areas of support that were most effective. I mean, as I said, across the board, we had very positive feedback from the young people, the 25 young people. And actually, they didn't speak so much about the areas where I think it's challenging for the service to impact, which is status in relation to immigration and criminal justice systems. Barnardo's obviously doesn't have influence over what decisions are made in relation to a young person or a child's immigration status. However, they are there to hold the hand and support those children and young people through that process. And in terms of their sort of experience of that process, which is very important for their recovery and their well-being and their safeguarding and so on. So I think, you know, the research recognises that this service is situated within an environment which is often hostile and challenging, and that practitioners are having to navigate that and support these children and people where they can, and that there will obviously be areas where it's hard for them to influence. Having said that, there are a series of case studies in the report which show some really tangible examples of how children and young people have been helped to navigate those criminal justice and immigration systems with, I guess, successes that are very kind of tangible for them.
That's great. Thank you so much, Anna. And thank you everybody for all your questions in the chat. Sorry, we couldn't get to them all. We're reaching the end of our time, so I'll hand back to Owen to wrap up for today.
Thanks so much, Izzy. Not too much to add, but thank you again to Izzy for your chairing today. Thank you so much, Anna, for coming and presenting, and thank you to everyone for coming. We are going to drop a link into the chat to a very quick anonymous feedback survey. It takes 2 minutes to complete, and we'd be really grateful for your thoughts. It just helps us to improve future events like this and decide what topics to run them on. And then the final thing to say is that when you signed up for this event, if you indicated that you were happy for us to stay in touch with you in future, we will add you to our newsletter where we share regular updates. If you didn't, you can sign up for that separately, or you can join our Google group mailing list that we maintain, that anyone can post updates to, ask questions and so on. And links to both of those are now also in the chat. So it's 1:15. We'll wrap up there. Thanks so much everyone again for coming, and we'll be in touch with a link to the recording of this event and also information on upcoming lunchtime seminars as well in due course. Thanks very much.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for attending, and thanks to Modern Slavery PEC as well.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Anna.